All right.
Welcome, everyone, including all of our ISM members and guests to our program today. The program is hosted by ISM New Jersey in partnership with Arkestro. Today, our speakers will be discussing uniting manufacturing CFOs and procurement for margin expansion. Now, a little bit about our wonderful speakers for today. With the Chief Supply Chain Officer and Chief Procurement Officer careers spanning 25 years in four Fortune 200 companies, Len DeCantia was most recently the Chief Procurement Officer for Johnson & Johnson. In this capacity, he led an award-winning organizational transformation for the procurement function, moving from a decentralized model to a globally integrated agile operating model optimized through digital technology. Our other speaker is Edmund. Edmund Zagorin is the founder and chief strategy officer of Arkestro, the leading predictive procurement orchestration platform. Prior to founding Arkestro, Edmund worked as a strategy sourcing advisor, helping large enterprises apply game theory and behavioral science to complex procurement operations. Edmund is a globally recognized thought leader and Forbes contributor on the emerging role of AI and machine learning in procurement and supply chain, and serves on the Thought Leadership Committee for the Institute for Supply Management and the advisory board of the Sourcing Industry Group, and was named among the 2023 Pros to Know by Supply and Demand Chain Executives. At this time, I'd like to turn the program over to Edmund.
Hey, thank you so much, Kathy. And thanks to ISM New Jersey for bringing us together for this webinar. It's a very timely topic, and I'm so excited that we have Len DeCantia with us to share some wisdom and best practices from a tremendous career. What I am going to do is first provide a short introduction on Arkestro for those that might not be familiar with us. And then we're going to go right into discussing this topic, uniting manufacturing CFOs and procurement for margin expansion. Is it always a power couple? Perhaps not, but with some work and some best practices, these two functions can work together like a dream. So first, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Arkestro. Arkestro is opening in partnership with Rutgers next week, the Museum of Procurement. If you are in the area in North Jersey or New York, drop by the Rutgers Business School at Newark. We are having a ribbon cutting event next Tuesday morning. I will be there. Our CEO will be there. The Dean of Rutgers Business School will be making some remarks, as well as a number of distinguished professors from the Rutgers Supply Chain Department. This is an opportunity to just take a moment, if you haven't met me before, just to give you a quick snapshot of my background. I started in procurement as a data analyst, grew into doing strategic sourcing and game theoretic negotiations, and ultimately worked as a sourcing advisor, helping large companies design and execute digital programs to implement game theory and behavioral science in their procurement and sourcing activities. As Kathy mentioned, I serve on the Advisory Thought Leadership Board of ISM and SIG. We were named a ProcureTech 100 and a Pros to Know by Demand and Supply Chain Executive magazine. Arkestro is backed by some of the greatest investment funds in the world, including NEA, Construct, Koch Disruptive Technologies, and For More Capital, as you can see, to bring game theory and machine learning to procurement. And on our board includes Ariba co-founder Rob DeSantis, as well as Cindy Podnos, who is a procurement startup founder herself from the late 90s, early 2000s, and Jeffrey Amelt, who is the CEO of General Electric. A little bit about what Arkestro does. We simulate a procurement activity before it begins using a combination of internal and external data sources. We then recommend orchestrating workflows with pre-filled smart defaults, recommending supplier pricing and other attributes of a procurement process. And then it handles the back and forth with internal stakeholders and suppliers through email to update the transaction in your system of record. And we embed within ERP and procure-to-pay systems more generally. So with that background out of the way, hopefully not too distracting from the topic at hand, we are going to get into the discussion. I think in order to understand the relationship between procurement and the CFO in large companies, we have to understand what procurement's contribution to the enterprise is and how it receives recognition for that contribution. So before we get to this question, which will be our first question, I'd love to ask you, Len, would you mind giving a little background on yourself beyond what Kathy shared and why you think it matters that procurement cultivates relationships with finance and other stakeholders, both in the C-suite and across the business?
Well, thank you, Edmund, and thank you, Kathy, for the introduction. Happy to be here with you today. Yeah, for me, from a background perspective, as Kathy mentioned, I have over 25 years experience as either a chief supplier or chief procurement officer. And the first half of that 25 years was purely chief supply officer. What I saw over the past 25, 30 years through that whole transition is a greater reliance on external parties for manufacturing and for execution. And not only in the supply chain space, but across the entire enterprise. So I made the transition about halfway through over to procurement because I just felt that really a lot of those activities that were happening outside the four walls really needed some of the fundamental practices that were gained in areas like supply chain or supply management. And so when you look at organizations and how they're structured and how they execute, knowing that more than 50% of your headcount and the majority of what you're executing is happening outside your own organization. It really, for me, elevates the value of contribution, at least the strategic contribution of the function. I think what's been a challenge for many years now is to be able to show that value and have the tools that allow you to show that value. And what we've seen, I think, over the past decade is the incredible advancement of a lot of that technology and a lot of those tools. And like anything else, the technology is always out in front of the processes, the practices, and ultimately the competencies of the organization. And so in the past couple of assignments around these transformations, it was really a responsibility of my role to not only create the vision of the value of the function, but to create the practices and really help to invest in those competencies that allow the function to be less of a doing function because technology does the work, but more of an enabling function, a function that's more there to provide insights and allow business owners or budget owners to make better and smarter decisions with some of those insights. Decisions that I think are critically important, not only in what's being spent, because it's more than just value. Probably the more important aspect of it is because a lot is outsourced, a lot of your innovation is coming from outside your four walls. And so it's really reframing the role of the function and redefining the way it engages with other key functions around the organization.
Absolutely. And I think that's really insightful that so much of what makes companies great these days comes down to choosing the right partners and managing the relationship with those partners in an intentional, data-driven, and ultimately productive, ideally a win-win framework. And I think that is a great transition to our first question of the day, which is, I think procurement is almost infamously underappreciated as a function in a lot of enterprises, whether it has the reputation of being a hall monitor or a gatekeeper or a process manager. Procurement has always strived to represent the strategic dimension of the work that we do to other stakeholders with varying degrees of success. And so I think I'd love to just hear your opinion on this question, kind of in an authentic way. Does procurement contribute more to a business than its organizational status reflect?
Yeah, and I think, the way I look at this question is, first of all, it should, right? And if you look at any P&L, your expenses are really in two places internally relative to your infrastructure, your head count, and where you invest your capital around what you're focused on executing. And then externally. And a lot of that work that happens externally is obviously where risk is and where success is. And so I basically, in terms of positioning the function, I look at a CPO role similar to a CHRO role. Whereas, the human resources department puts in the process, the practices, gives you a sense of market value and talent that's out there. But ultimately, the hiring manager has to make that last decision. I think the same with procurement. I think procurement needs to be aware of what's happening in terms of the dynamics of the markets in which you're outsourcing and what's happening in those markets, who's strategically aligned with your organization, and really giving that budget owner options, choices, or maybe a best choice for that. Now, there's a second part of it, and I think this is the part where a lot of sometimes procurement functions fall short. There's the feeling that, I helped with the contract, it's in place, let me move on. But the reality is the work begins after the contract is signed. And I think that's where the competencies and the investment in practices really need to have more of a consideration for those organizations that are going to be more successful. And what I'm talking about is, and many times with business owners or budget owners, some of those relationships break down because there's a breakdown in communications and there's a lack of understanding around common goals. So if you equate that to the HR experience, once you're hired, they don't leave everything in the hands of the hiring manager or supervisor. The HR organization is there as a steward to ensure mutual success. And I think that's the role procurement needs to take, is to ensure mutual success. And I think that's where some of the competencies around better understanding the business objectives, better understanding the talents and the competencies that you're trying to buy from the third party that complement your internal competencies. And ultimately, they shouldn't be measured by the fact only of, hey, here's a contract, we saved X number of dollars on that contract. That's just one piece of it. How successful was the initiative? How well was the execution handled? And how well is that relationship going to build for future opportunities that better drive next wave innovations or next wave opportunities?
I think that that's so important to reflect not just the cost impact, but the total value impact, and really have the stakeholder be championing that value as much as possible. Because ultimately, we in procurement are service providers to the people that manage the budget, that manage the P&L, and that really resonates. For those that are just joining us, hello. We are talking about procurement's role in manufacturing with finance and how procurement can partner with finance. If you have questions, we are going to do questions at the end, so please drop them in the chat. And now we are going to also share some data. So to this question, does procurement contribute more to a business than its organizational status reflect? It seems like the answer is yes. So Kearney does a chief procurement officer survey. They found that 80% of C-level officers have, said that procurement has made strategically valuable contributions, yet only 31% of CFOs and other C-level officers say procurement proactively drives their strategic agenda. Procurement is thus often in a reactive mode of getting a savings number to go chase for the year, and not articulating the value that it could provide. A lot of organizational consultants and procurement leaders have described this phenomenon as not having a seat at the table, of driving its own agenda. And that's something that for those that have been in procurement for a long time, we've heard a lot. I want to now turn to 2023. We're in a very interesting economic period. It feels like maybe we've been in a recession, but it hasn't been that bad, or we're, maybe we've been experiencing the beginning of a soft landing. It's really just quite strange. And I think it's been interesting to see a lot of economists pontificating about exactly how strange it is, with record low unemployment, record high inflation, inflation coming down slightly, but a lot of categories of the economy still feeling headwinds and significant pain, and especially supply chain and procurement teams are dealing with this. And so in 2023, what are manufacturing CFOs asking procurement leaders to deliver? So Len, I put this question to you. If you're a manufacturing CFO right now, what are you going to your CPO and chief supply chain officer and asking for help with?
Yeah, so I completely agree. We are going through, I think, quite transformational times, and you're right. I think the past few years have felt a little strange. You just look at your performance of your 401k, and you can imagine adding that to the cost of everything around us. I think we're now going into a period where we dealt with some pretty significant scarcity issues coming through the pandemic, and even coming out of the pandemic, because we're going through a changing time. I think we're seeing a significant amount of catastrophic events above and beyond what I saw in my 40-year career, in terms of the frequency and the impact of those events, the significant ones in climate. We've got geopolitical issues, and you add to that still some of the risks associated with managing through the virus, going through another cycle. And I think over the past couple of years, organizations have been able to kind of temper the earnings impact by passing through the increased supply chain costs to the customer. And I think those days are over. And so now, margin expansion through price increases is not going to work anymore, right? And so you're going to have to go back, and you're going to have to be able to better understand, your levels of productivity, but more importantly, where you're investing and how you're investing. Look, in my last assignment, Johnson & Johnson spent $40 billion. So if you take something like taxes and you say, I wish you could, right? Many organizations wish they could, but you can't source taxes, right? So that's $40 billion of spend with third parties. And really, it's not just showing up at the how stage, but it's really understanding the why and the what that makes you be better at the how stage. And I think it's a process that was very static forever. When we started to introduce things like sales and operations planning, and I was around when the computer first made its introduction, it was kind of this yearly cycle. We did all of this work leading up to the year. We put together our roadmap for the year, and then we checked in every quarter to see how things were going, right? But you can't do that anymore. First of all, we have tremendous tools like your organization provides that allows you to be able to be in a cockpit and flying through the clouds of all of this world that we're living in, with all of these events, but with instruments, and being able to make sure you're on course, and knowing where you have to make the adjustments, and having radar and understanding the weather that's ahead of you. And I think if we look at the supply side like we look at the customer side, there's a great opportunity now to look at things like the fact that you should have multiple contracts in place. You should have purchase orders in place for everything that you're buying, because it's a lot simpler and a lot quicker process today. And you should have predictability on when those contracts are due. And you shouldn't just wait when the contract is due to understand what's happening in the market and with your supplier. Or if you're doing buys against an open blanket purchase order, you shouldn't assume that the commodity costs that were in place at that time or the market dynamics of the vendors who were in place at that time are the same. You should be constantly monitoring what's happening around you, just like your flight instruments. And all those tools are finally available today. So it puts the CFO in a different place. The CFO shouldn't be in the place of, hey, this is what we told the street we're going to do this year. And every quarter, let's just make sure we're on track to do that, and we'll move a few things, right? Because you're going to miss opportunity. You're going to miss tremendous opportunities, or you're going to not be able to look out around the corner and see something that could be of significant impact. So you really need to be working very closely with your procurement team, partnering and collaborating with them, because ultimately you're there to support the budget owner who's trying to achieve their objectives with the tools of the company's finances to be able to do that. And so I think the relationship between the CFO and the CPO is critical to the success of the budget owner, because ultimately the success of the business is the success of the budget owner. Because the budget owner is where execution begins and ends, right? So they drive revenue, they drive execution on the manufacturing floor. And ultimately, you're trying to take some of those surprises away from them, and you're trying to create an environment. I kind of call it the invisible hand. Can you be the invisible hand that knows what's happening in the world around them so that they could get out in front of issues, or they can be more responsive to the issues to take some of those significant impacts out, or to jump on those significant opportunities when they're there?
Yeah, I think that's really profound. And, it actually reminds me of something when I was first starting out as a startup founder, and having some conversations with board members about the best way to do financial analysis for an early stage company. And, the topic came up, well, should we do a top-down model or a bottom-up model? And one of our board members smiled and said, well, both. You have to do both.
Right.
And I think that in the conversation around numbers between finance and procurement, we often get stuck on like this annual savings number, this annual, kind of, here's what we have to do. Let's figure out how to make it work and get as close to it as we can. And I think, to your point, not only is that in many cases, like, where is that number coming from? Like, is it realistic? But it's often too low. Like, procurement can often deliver more value, and not just in the form of cost reductions, but in the form of, I've seen procurement teams that have programs that are revenue generating, that contribute to the top line,
right,
and supplier partnerships that have an impact there as well. I want to reflect that in 2023, especially coming, kind of, it feels like we're still in almost a hangover year from the champagne party of 2021, the era of cheap money from the Fed that drove a certain amount of inflation, as well as some supply chain issues themselves, which contributed to that. People have been taking a lot of price increases, and I know a lot of procurement teams that we work with are excited to kind of say, all right, now it's time to reality check. And so this is just one statistic, piece of data to answer this question, which is that 95% of manufacturers surveyed plan to ask suppliers for cost reductions this year. I found this to be perhaps not surprising, but what are the other 5% doing? You kind of wonder, but it really does, I think, speak to a change and a shift in the market, especially in industries like automotive or food and beverage or chemical manufacturing or consumer goods, where suppliers have really been coming hat in hand and saying, hey, we have to increase prices. Our costs have gone up. Logistics has gotten more expensive. Warehousing's gotten more expensive. It's hard to find labor and so on. And while I think a lot of that has been well justified, we're at a point where, you know, a lot of finance and procurement teams are coming together and saying, all right, now that we're at the top of the roller coaster, maybe it's time to turn a corner and start pushing back in the other direction. I think it's equally important to note something you said earlier, which is just because this is what CFOs might be focused on, this can't be the limit of procurement's value proposition, because that's another thing that gets procurement in a reactive mode where its value is reduced to the framework or KPI of cost savings. And so we are going to talk about some bottom-up approaches for financial modeling for cost savings that allow procurement and finance to keep score. But I want to be very clear that the reason for that is to make sure that in the relationship between finance and procurement, that conversation doesn't take up all the space and suck up all the air out of the room, so that there's still room for dialogue about what is in the best interest of stakeholders, how procurement can be an enabler and a service provider, and ultimately help be a kind of internal consultant for the budget owner to maximize their value. So I want to move now to our third question, and this is actually our final kind of conversation point question. We have a couple tools here that we wanted to share with our audience today. And so I'm going to ask you this question, and then we'll go through some of the frameworks, the management frameworks, to kind of dig deeper into this. And then if you're just joining us, we're discussing how manufacturing CFOs and procurement can get on the same page and drive margin expansion, be a true power couple. And if you have questions, we'd love to hear them. Please drop them in the chat, and we will come and look through that after we tackle this topic. So Led, how can CFOs partner with procurement and supply chain to create cost value while supporting supply resiliency and continuity? And it really is important that these are not a trade-off, that it really is both, but it's easier said than done. So how can this how have you seen, or what experiences have you had where you've really seen CFOs that get this right, and then procurement and supply chain teams that are great partners in this exercise?
Yeah, and I think supply resiliency is so critically important in today's world. Reference to what we've mentioned earlier around the dynamics of what's happening today and what we've seen. And it was obviously such a significant issue during the pandemic, right? Because I think, first of all, the world found out what supply chain was, and in many cases, it was difficult when different parts of the world and different countries were managing their way through it in very different ways. And so, for someone like me in my previous role, what became very important was not only the health of the supplier, but the supplier's employees, to make sure that they were in a safe environment and they were allowed to do their work in a safe environment. And you'll hear a lot of procurement and supply chain people talk about tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers, right? Because a lot of energy and effort is really focused on your tier 1 suppliers. But when you think about the complexity of a global economy and an integrated world, things can happen way upstream, beyond your supplier to sources of commodities and supply that are all impacted by all of this. And I think that's where this concept of a greater predictability comes in, right? Because how do you link scenarios? And when you're talking about something like the pandemic, no one had a playbook that they pulled off the shelf and said, okay, how do you get through a global pandemic, a once in 100-year global pandemic? But what I saw during that whole event was a considerable amount of new practices that I thought were significant, that you want to hold on to kind of as a best practice, right? I saw greater collaboration happening internally as well as externally, right? And I think that's really what we're forcing here is, are we creating points of greater collaboration where you look at a budget and a business plan as a dynamic, right? So you're not only looking at what you need and who you're going to buy from, and then just cast the plan in place. So, you and I have used the analogy of a map. So, I'm a boomer, so I used to pull out a map in the car to read a map, and before I took off, this was the path, and I hoped that everything was fine on that path. But now I just pick up my iPhone and I use Waze, and Waze is constantly monitoring what's happening on that journey and giving me a sense of changes that I need to make while I'm navigating through that journey. And I think that's where procurement and finance can be using those types of tools working together, right, to support and enable the business partner who's focusing on executing, whether they're executing, a product or a service, to ensure that they're constantly aware of what's happening in the world around them. And if things change, how can they respond to that? Or if things change within their four walls relative to some of that decision making, how can they better respond to that change, whether it's something that's happening at the customer level or the competitor level? And I think that's where that type of collaboration between finance and procurement becomes so very, very important. If they put the budget owner in the middle and they don't make it a procurement finance sandwich, what's the procurement finance? You need to take 15% out of your budget, go see procurement. So you've already created an environment that doesn't really support collaboration, right? Then all of a sudden the black hats are there. But it's more around, hey, we know the world is a challenge. We know that the customer is constantly changing. The competitors are constantly out there doing something that require us to be better and smarter. And the people we do business with are dealing with their own challenges. So we're there to help you, right, understand at least what's happening in the supplier space and the budget space, because sometimes budgets change during the year. And we're not just giving you pressure, we're giving you options, we're giving you tools, we're giving you scenarios that might help you as the knowledge center and the critical internal customer in this process, the greatest opportunity for success. It's a very different way of operating. And I think it requires a different set of competencies in how the procurement function works internally as well as externally. But most importantly, I think there's a lot that can be learned from finance for the procurement people and from finance from the procurement people, right? So if you look at this collaboration as incredible learning and partnering, I think the business partner, who's ultimately the person that you want to see succeed because it's critical to your organization's success, can really get value and start to come to you for some of those solutions, or look to you for those solutions, which is even better because you're helping them better understand and you're helping them see where the roads are closed or where the traffic is, so that you can get to your final destination. Not the one that was on the annual map that somebody did in the fourth quarter, but the one that's a better reflection of the world that we're living in today.
I really love that analogy with the glove compartment map that you kind of pull out and go, okay, where am I and where am I going? And is this map even right? And how do I get there? And when I learned to drive as a millennial, we had the glove box map. So, I got to have a little bit of that experience before Google Maps and then Waze came out. And I think for me, the main difference was navigating to a place I'd never been before became so much easier. That it really encouraged me to go to different places that I might otherwise, not go to, or would go with a friend. It was just made it a lot easier to explore the world. And I think that to some extent, it's funny, I went back after thinking through this distinction between the map and Waze and looked at the some of the original patents for the technology behind Google Maps and Waze, and it's called predictive navigation. And predictive navigation just means it knows where you are, it knows what's going on around you, and it gives you, hey, here's what's next, and here's some different routes you could take along the way. And I think that that's really what predictive procurement orchestration is in terms of the difference with kind of classical procurement. And it's so interesting that the common metaphor for procurement strategy, category strategy, and execution is a roadmap, right? It literally is, you're driving on the road in your category, whatever, spend, supply category that may be. And here are some KPIs that you can apply to your financial and operational performance. And here are some routes you can take that have different likely outputs. And so as procurement teams, get better, I think, at being able to bring more to the table in terms of, hey, we've got this ability now to find opportunities on the fly, to adapt to changing market realities, to, as commodity markets and other markets like logistics and freight move faster, we can respond in real time. We don't need to anchor everything in an annual spend cube from which a category strategy is produced, from which, a set of projects and a quarterly check-in. We actually have the ability to generate opportunities really as they come up with sufficient lead time to make decisions to reprioritize. And it made me think that, one of the corporate functions that I think has done a really good job at this kind of bottom-up value modeling from adaptability is sales and marketing. And really measuring things as opportunities and then tracking them through until they convert into customer relationships and revenue and upsells and so on. And so I think one of the things that we're seeing across the procurement and supply chain landscape is a new management framework where people are taking the uncertainty of the status quo as a given, not being surprised or frustrated by it, but simply saying this is, change is the new constant, this is the way of the world. And then really being disciplined about understanding the stages in their funnel and creating and communicating future value, predictable, repeatable value through that framework. And so one of the kind of best practices that's come up is breaking spend not just into buckets associated with categories, but effort in terms of the change and complexity of working with stakeholders on it. And so this is a very simple matrix: money on the floor, money on the table, and money on the top shelf, in terms of, do you have to stretch to get it? Is it really close, or is it something that you have to push and pull? And this practice is to recognize that not all value is created equal. One size does not fit all, and often it fits none. Second, introduce this idea of spend under prediction, which just means, is it in the funnel at all? Not is it addressable, but is it actually going to come up within that opportunity funnel? And then 3, use that conversion funnel for each category to track value from opportunity to validation to delivery. And in terms of that segmentation, a really easy rule of thumb is, if it's the same item and same supplier, but it's just a different price, maybe that's easy, and if it's the same, item, but if it's a different supplier, that's a little bit harder. You got to go to someone else. Maybe they're not approved, or maybe they're not approved for that item or that geography or that region. So there's a little change that has to go there. And then, wow, we've got to get a different item, different quantity, different. Wow, that's a stretch, right? That might be working with the stakeholder, a lot of massaging. They might have brand loyalty to a product, or they might have other things they've bought that aren't compatible or integrated with the new item. So just thinking about the top of the procurement funnel in that way, and then proposing that once you have your addressable spend, so for every billion in addressable spend, you can have some of it that goes into the top of the funnel. And this is just spend that some data says you can get a better offer. And then spend under quote is spend where you've gotten a better offer. And spend under award is where you've accepted that better offer. So the stakeholder, you and finance all come together and said, let's do it. Let's make a change that's going to impact the bottom line, and then really delivering that. And this, by the way, is a predictive model. And I think that that's really in the same way that predictive navigation helps people get where they're going by tracking everything that's happening around. Predictive procurement just really is mindful of kind of where things are at in the process. And so I wanted to turn this back to you, and we are going to take some questions here. We have some questions in the chat, so we're going to go to that in just a second. But I wanted to ask, in reflecting on this funnel diagram, what's something that people listening to this webinar can take back to their procurement team in terms of like a super practical, just like framework for measuring procurement's performance in different categories, or like holistically the function, representing that contribution to finance or to the C-suite?
Yeah, I think, I love the funnel. It was a practice that I know we had a pretty rigorous and a great approach to in my most recent assignment. I think it's about business planning. And I don't think procurement should be different than anywhere else. You should have, and in many cases, most organizations where they are segmenting suppliers and they're contracting either on a 1 or a 3-year basis. So that fundamentally means every year you have different amounts of addressable spend. You have different contracts coming to different periods. You're introducing new innovations sometimes, so you're bringing in new suppliers, you're obsoleting old innovation, and you're obsoleting old suppliers. So really looking at your business strategy, your spend strategy across your enterprise on a 3-year horizon, so that you can basically have those years where you have a greater amount of possible savings or addressable spend, and you have some years where you have less, right? But that's okay, because that's one dimension of it. And you mentioned other dimensions of value. I think the ability for the function to deliver innovation and revenue generating value is there, specifically if you're managing those relationships with those suppliers that you've put into that category of strategic. And it shouldn't be because I spend a lot of money with them. Your most strategic suppliers could be a supplier that's bringing you an innovation that you can translate to your own market for the future, right? So it's operating on a 3-year horizon, and it's being very thoughtful in how you segment your suppliers and how you address the areas of innovation. And then, as you mentioned earlier, around resilience and reliability, you really need to make sure in today's world that you truly understand your suppliers, your critical suppliers, and those suppliers that could have an impact on your business continuity. And you have to fold in those factors of sustainability. So having active programs in sustainability and governance more than anything else become that much more important, right? Because the regulatory environments have been a real challenge over the past few years. You look at what's happening in China around the regulatory environment in the United States, and I mean, that's a dimension that's going to continue to become that much more complex. So it requires a level of sophistication. And I think that's where, organizations like Arkestro can be a huge help, because if you can become that dashboard, that tool, so that the procurement professional can better partner with the finance team and with the business partner, right? And so that data can help, and that data not only translates to insights, but then they can elevate it through wisdom of the strategy of the organization and a particular business need. The annual go chase the savings for me, I think, has worked for a long, long time, but it's not going to allow your function to provide a competitive advantage. And ultimately, because the function is that much more important today, it could really impact the health of many companies if they don't embrace these practices. And really challenge their procurement leaders to think this way, to behave this way, and to elevate the function. Because I think no one's going to come and give you the ability to do that. You're going to have to lead that charge. And I talk to the procurement individuals, and you don't have to be the CPO to do this. You can lead from every seat in this space. You can start to introduce these practices. You can start to create little examples of success in parts of the organization that are easily scalable once you've been able to prove that success. So I really love the idea here, Edmund, around the pipeline, the cycle, and being more predictive in what you can achieve as opposed to the traditional reactive. And there's more money. Your point is very valid. There's a lot more money, or I should say value on the table when you do it in a more predictive way than a reactive.
Well, and Len, I think you make a really good point for what it means to elevate the function to the next generation as well. The procurement teams that are really going to be transformative in the next 20 years, we all know are going to have to compete for talent. And in competing for talent, I think, it's funny. I speak with chief procurement officers and chief supply chain officers quite regularly, but I also speak with category managers and senior buyers and people from across the organization. And the one thing that I always hear is, tell me what I need to do to be great at my job, because if you tell me cost savings and I deliver it, and then you say that's not good enough, it's really hard for me to be excited about delivering that outcome. Yeah. Especially if the stakeholder is not happy at the end of a project. And so I think that, the fundamental challenge in procurement I've always found is, how do you keep score? Do we have a common understanding that's shared with the stakeholder, finance, and procurement of what winning means and what excellence means? And we all know that cost savings is part of it, but you can't reduce it to cost savings. And I think that nuance is really key. One of the things I do like about the conversion funnel is that I talk with a lot of people that work in procurement analytics or data and analytics teams that support procurement operations. And typically they're supporting a purchasing team and a sourcing team. On the sourcing side, they might be doing market research. They might be pulling together information about suppliers. They might be analyzing responses from RFPs. And on the purchasing side, they're doing a lot of, financial cost center pivots on spend, truing up the spend cube and checking in on utilization of contracts and preferred suppliers. And one of the things that I hear is, oh, it's so hard for us to get good data, good quality data, and we've had a tough time partnering with IT to get the data we need to deliver the reports to our stakeholders. Wow, if you can go and present a business case that says, hey, if our data is a little bit cleaner, I'll be able to put more money in the possible savings category. Like this is going to add to my addressable spend. It's going to add to my confidence around, the top of that value funnel. All of a sudden, it creates a framework around procurement's value more generally that allows procurement to, in some cases, say, hey, this is a blocker for me delivering the value that I know that my stakeholders want and that I know finance is asking for. So with that, I do want to go into the questions here. Let's see what we got. Okay, perfect. So it looks like we have a question here around, do companies measure cost savings differently at different companies? And what are some ways to measure value beyond savings? Like, what are some other KPIs that really can track with kind of procurements as an enabling function. Len, I'd love to hear, what are some ways, like in like quarterly or annual business reviews, that procurement can point to something really concrete and say, kind of look at this and like, did you like this and do you want more of it? You know, that kind of something really concrete to hang your hat on.
Yeah, for sure. On the cost savings, I mean, you really need to make sure finance is really the one that signs off on all the numbers, right? And and if you're spending all that time trying to measure how much you're saving, that you're missing opportunities to be strategic. But if you can find a way to do that, I think that's great. And to your point earlier about how value comes in many, many different ways. If you're buying the same thing but at a different price, if you're buying something different, you should have an approach that your CFO is comfortable with, and can translate that to value. I think the other areas I think companies in procurement can really bring value is, I know I take a lot of pride in the work that we've done in areas like diverse and minority-owned supplier spend. I think that is a significant amount of value that you bring to an organization. There's an incredible amount of innovation that comes from minority-owned, women-owned, diverse suppliers. They truly reflect and your customer base. So the insight and knowledge that comes from those suppliers is amazing. In many cases, they're local, so they give you a better sense of what's happening in those particular markets where you're doing business. And I think it's really something that is important to many stakeholders. I think it's important to your employees. They do want to work for, and your talent wants to work for those companies that are purposeful and want to have a positive impact on the world. I think it's important to your customers. I think customers are interested in what many organizations are doing to help make the world a better place. And then ultimately, your shareholders recognize that if you have happy customers and happy employees, you're going to have happy shareholders. So I think that's an area where I've seen more of an interest in the procurement function bringing significant value. I think the other area around innovation really falls under that supplier relationship management space. When I look at some of my recent experiences, one most recently was, with Johnson & Johnson being one of the creators of the accelerated vaccine for COVID, one of the critical components of that vaccine was the final phase 3 trial, where it was a significant, probably one of the largest trial that a company ever undertook, probably one of the largest trials ever, and it really needed to be a diverse trial. And so the suppliers of the CROs that we worked with were extremely capable and brought incredible innovation to the table around the world in being able to do that. So I think that whole issue around looking at your suppliers not as a cost strain, but as a source of innovation is really where procurement can add a tremendous amount of value. And that's where you have to be a really good storyteller. You have to be able to tell the broader organization how that works. I'll give you one more example from COVID, which was just an incredible experience, I'm sure, for all of us in the world, right? One of the areas that J&J was introducing new innovation was with arterial fibrillation. It affects the heart, and basically traditionally surgeons were trained at a training site, and so they were kind of given all the tools and they were trained on site to be able to do that. But with the shutdown process in China, how could you train the surgeons who were at tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 cities? And our supplier brought some incredible innovation to the table around virtual training that could allow certification and qualification. So it was able to bring that innovation to that community that was impacted by it, and it created greater access for those patients who were removed from all of that. And it was an innovation that was translated globally now for the organization. So that's where suppliers, if you frame them in the way of a source of innovation, and the procurement organization becomes a window, an enabler for that, working closely with the R&D organization, the ultimate business partner, you can put value on revenue growth for sure.
I think that's that's tremendously impactful for procurement's role as a strategic player in modern companies, because that is what I think, every corporate leadership team is trying to figure out. How can we, keep up with the times as the pace of innovation continues to accelerate? Suppliers have to be part of that story, because suppliers that don't move forward are ultimately going to hold some organizations back, whereas suppliers that race forward will help bring that change, and I think really deliver. It's been interesting, from where I sit in Silicon Valley, watching in manufacturing the birth of startups that are multi-billion-dollar companies like Tesla and Astra and Lucid, and some of the rocket companies, SpaceX, of course, and others. And what you've seen is really a new approach to manufacturing that's sprung up, and I think that's been driving a lot of questions, not just about electric vehicles or the specific industry, but really business process questions that affect procurement and supply chain. One of the things that's interesting I've noticed in working with more traditional automotives is this friction between supply chain and procurement. Supply chain often wants to keep things not unchanged, but as kind of stable as possible, keep the relationships, and procurement's often bringing other options to the table, and there's that kind of natural friction. How, setting finance aside for a moment, how can procurement and supply chain stay on the same page about the pace of change, or the opportunities versus the costs of change?
Yeah, no, look, I spent the first 10 years of my career in manufacturing, and I don't want any variances to manage in my plant. I want all my raw materials to look the same, all my spare parts to be the same, right? And I think it's that whole concept of how do you introduce change in a way that all the stakeholders are comfortable with that process, right? And so in some cases, you have opportunities to do small test and learns, and then you translate those test and learns to broader scalable opportunities. And I think that's probably for me been a wonderful experience, and I'd love your perspective on this. I was amazed over the past decade as a CPO in this space, and having been a CSO. You have to understand, my first experience with the big heavy ERP systems, and now we've gone through this era of best-in-class type of SaaS systems that gave you some of those tools that you could do some test and learn and scale. What do you see from a technology standpoint in this space to kind of achieve some of the objectives we're talking about here? What do you call this new era, Edmund, that we're going into over this next decade?
Well, it's an interesting question, because I think I've been very excited to see the growth of so-called, best of breed SaaS applications. And I think that the one thing for me and for Arkestro that was always missing was, the embedding with existing ERP and procure to pay systems in a really smooth, integrated way. And then also the data, like really making sure that the data foundation of procurement, which is key for reporting and also key for what we call process orchestration or predictive orchestration, is really there. So you can know what, price you should pay for something and which suppliers your most preferred, really embedded within a process without having to know or guess or select from a drop-down menu. And I will say, the age is upon us of self-driving vehicles. I had my first ride in a self-driving car the other day, and I was a little scary, but it was also very exciting to see. And so I think that if we've just been in the era of moving from the map to Waze, to the turn-by-turn directions, I think we're beginning with predictive procurement orchestration, embarking on the self-driving era of procurement, where it's up to us to say where to go and how to get there, but we shouldn't be manipulating every dial and lever on the dashboard and kind of turning the wrench ourselves. I think we're going to see systems that are much more directable, and where we're ultimately in the driver's seat, or in my case, I was sitting in the back seat and watching a ghostly driver's steering wheel make all of its turns. But I think that's where procurement is at. Folks, this has been an absolute pleasure. Len, always exciting to catch up with you, hear your perspective. I want to be mindful that we've gone a couple minutes over here, and I want to give people, let people get back and to get on with their day. If you are interested in these topics, we have a template here. You can make your own funnel for any one of your categories and see what this might look like for you. It's super easy to do this in PowerPoint and Excel just to get started. And then, of course, there are other tools to support that. If you are interested in learning about procurement's storied history, we are opening the Museum of Procurement in partnership with Rutgers Business School in Newark next week. You can come down and meet us, see a reproduction of the first purchase order from 3,000 years ago in the Sumerian city of Uruk, all the way up to the modern ERP system and the birth of today's supply chains. And with that, I'm going to say another big thank you to our hosts, ISM and Kathy Perna with ISM New Jersey. And that is it.